for being with us the last little bit. We've taken a little break from our sermon series, Ready for Anything, about the book of Colossians in the New Testament. We're going to get back to that this week. We've had a couple of special days mixed into this, and as we continue looking at life, we're going to say that we have a new section here, which we are now talking about anchoring to home. Sort of a transition into a new section, but understand that headings we might find in the Bible. So I'm going to move your platform here because I'm going to crash into it and we're going to have a loud bang as the mic falls off. So, as we go through a new section in the Bible, a new section even in the sermon series, understand that's artificial. That's not in the original. In fact, even chapter breaks and verse breaks, they were added later to help us understand. And so the fact that we're coming to a new section, there is a little bit of artificial to this. And I say this because, and why this is important, because we've been coming through a section we've called Ready for Anything, by looking at life. And we've talked about different ways in which we look at life, in which we understand how God is at work in our lives by doing some remarkable things. We've talked about things like love and peace. In the last section, we ended up talking with these words. Let the words of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, and thankfulness in your hearts to God. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. And I bring up all this bit about, we kind of sometimes put in a little bit of an artificial division idea that he's going to a new topic, because actually he's using what's gone on before about thankfulness and worship and love and peace to springboard into talking about families. He's been talking about deepening our spiritual lives, deepening who we are, and he gives us a whole bunch of means as to how we're going to do that. And he tells us a little bit about what it's going to look like. And then he starts talking about family. So I'm going to tell you where we're going with this. It's family. Particularly this week, marriage is part of how God develops our spiritual lives. What he is doing in our hearts to make us go deeper. Marriage, family life are part of the struggle to go deeper into the things of Jesus. And I'm going to tell you right now that home, marriage, is the hardest place to live out the gospel. And therefore, it is the most important. It is critical. In the book of Ephesians, in Ephesians chapter 5, we have a parallel passage. Ephesians and Colossians are two books of the Bible that are very similar. It certainly seems that Paul wrote them at the same time, or at least very close together, and he wrote them kind of with the same themes going through his mind, and the two churches that he's writing to when he writes his letter are actually geographically quite close together. They're very similar. Ephesians is a little bit longer, but in it, right before he gets to this passage where he writes about marriage, it says this: look carefully, then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. He adds out right before the part we talk about today. Is he writing about the fact, okay, the days are evil, the world's bad out there? That's what's evil? That's true. I kind of think more what he's after here is the days that can be evil even within the church and within our lives. And he's thinking about that there's going to be struggles. And then he launches in, he starts talking about marriage. Make the best use of your time. Make the best use of even marriage. To grow deeper into the things of God. Part of how we grow in Christ is we know Christ within marriage. Now, I tend to like to be very organized on Sunday mornings and know long in advance what I'm preaching on. And so I kind of divided up the book of Colossians, and I said, okay, I'm going to preach this week. And this kind of went through. We kind of came to Easter, and I knew where I wanted to end at Easter, and then a couple of weeks ago I was looking at my schedule and realized I divided what we're going to look at today into two different sermons. And so we were going to talk about wives' responsibilities this week and husbands next week. And I realized I'm preaching to husbands on Mother's Day. I realized that, you know what, that is not going to work. And there might be a lot of moms who would like to say, yeah, preach to the dads this week. But that's okay, because really, I end up combining because that kind of works, because this isn't written saying, wives do this, husbands do that. This is bringing it together, saying this is the gospel. Marriage is not just, you've got responsibility, I got it's coming together and living out the very gospel of Jesus Christ. Throughout, if you've been with us, and if you haven't, I've got lots of sermons on our YouTube channel. You can find a link on our website. Throughout this, we've talked about we need to be ready for it. In the case of Colossians, this church, this city is about to be destroyed by an earthquake. Now, of course, they didn't know that. Paul didn't know that that's what he is preparing them for. He had no idea. He's saying, be ready for anything, because anything can happen. And that is life, isn't it? This world is not predictable. I have no idea what's going to happen in my life next week, a year, 2 years. None of us do. We're all living an unpredictable life. Now, what Paul is doing is saying, I want you to be anchored right so that you are ready whatever might occur. Whatever unpredictability comes up. And it's great marriage. And part of how he is preparing us for the unpredictable, to be ready as people who worship, people who are following God, taking advantage of every opportunity to live out the gospel in our lives. Part of how he is doing that is by giving us marriage. As an example, this is what the gospel is. In Colossians, if this is going to work, Kelly, I may need you to flip it forward one. There we go. Fortunately, I've only got one slide up there this week. Our passage this week. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be harsh with them. Why is Paul concerned with marriage in a passage about spiritual growth? Maybe we need to back up and ask the question, why did God create marriage? What's its purpose? Why does it exist? You ask people these days, most people will say, you get married to be happy. So, kind of like what most people would say. Some people, if you read some of the academics Particularly in some of the old school academics, they would say it's all about procreation. Others who might look historically or something say, oh, marriage came out of the whole evolutionary process to provide security for people. Security. So what happens when those things don't happen? For years, I would kind of always ended up doing services in nursing homes. And for a number of years, I remember watching a gentleman who I knew a fair bit, whose wife was in the nursing home with pretty severe dementia. And he would come in there every day to kind of get her ready for the day, and then feed her and look after her. His health was at such a point that he couldn't have her at home anymore, but he could come in, look after her, and feed her. And, you know, even though she wasn't able to respond or really talk in any way that made sense, he would spend his days just talking with her, filling her in with what's going on in life in the world. And as I would watch this, I would say, is doing something like that always happy? That was a lot of work, particularly an old body. To have anything to do with procreation? Well, probably in their 80s, they're not going to have more kids. To have to do with security? She was safe in the nursing home. She was fine. So what is the purpose in a marriage like that? If it doesn't match the criteria, if the world says this is what marriage is all about, does it any longer have a purpose? Or do we need a better understanding of what marriage is all about? I remember reading a book years ago that asked the question, what if marriage was to make us holy instead of happy? Love that question. What if it was to make us holy rather than happy? The author went on to say, that doesn't mean he doesn't want us happy. Doesn't mean there shouldn't be happiness in marriage. But what he's saying is, that is not its purpose. Its purpose is to make us more like Jesus. Happiness is not always a realistic goal every moment of life. Happiness that's just kind of the way it is. It's a fleeting emotion. There are times that are hard. And marriage is meant more to anchor us into Jesus than anything else. A wedding celebration can all be about a big cake, a party, a celebration. And maybe more importantly, it is the beginning stages, the first steps in a model of what it means to live a deeper Christian life. It is in of itself a means to grow. The church has long looked at kind of divorces out there and said, you know, okay, people come to us for a wedding, we should do premarital counseling, maybe we can help with the divorce rate by doing that. And I know for years I've done that, where you get people together and you talk things through, budgets and, you know, personality tests, and you do this and that to kind of prepare them for marriage. And I know I've done that for years and then watched and seen lots of people still end up divorced. And I've come to realize that maybe the model's broken. Maybe even how I've been doing it has not been the most helpful thing. And as I've continued to do premarital counseling, still do some of those things. But I've come to realize that maybe the more important thing to do is just basic spiritual growth of the couple. Saying, here is Jesus, here's you, here's how you grow to be more like him. that maybe it's just an opportunity to talk more about Jesus with people. And maybe more important than just figuring out, okay, well, you're going to face this issue in your life. I don't know what other issues somebody's going to face. It's unpredictable. Rather than worrying about that, worrying about, are you deep with Jesus as a starting place of marriage? It's often been said that our spiritual journeys are often like a triangle. If you picture a triangle, we've God on the top, us in the corner, and we have other people, whether it be our spouse or someone else, but spouse being the most important relationship we're generally in. And kind of think of that triangle with lines pointing to each person in the triangle with a head going each way. Because we give things and we receive things in relationships. In our relationship with God, what do we give God? We give worship. We give obedience. What do we give? What does God give to us? God gives us direction. He gives us purpose. He gives us the fruit of the Spirit. He gives us love. So what happens when we remove God from that occasion, from that model that I've given? What happens when we take God out of that? All of a sudden, the things that we naturally give God are gone. So do we worship? Who do we give our following to? Who do we obey? Who do we receive love and the fruit of the Spirit from? Who do we receive direction from? Well, all of a sudden we start to put that on other things. And perhaps we start to worship Him a long way. And let me tell you, a lot of people might end up worshiping. They think it might be the other person, but usually it's worshiping the ideal of a relationship. Or they end up worshiping lust. They're worshiping something. And the problem is they're taking God out of the relationship. Or maybe I'm not receiving these things from God. So I'm looking to it from somebody else. I'm looking to receive fulfillment and purpose from somewhere. And if I'm getting it and expecting it from my spouse, what am I going to be left with is disappointment, right? Because I can't get that from them. And we expect too much. And maybe one of the reasons we struggle with marriage, particularly inside the church, is God is trying to get our attention. That we need to put God in His proper place. And when there's struggles with marriage within the church, maybe it's a sign that the church is not always full of God. Tragically, the divorce rate inside and outside the church, depending on the statistical model you look at, is about the same. Some of the stats I've seen have it actually, the divorce rate's actually a little higher inside the church. Does that sound right? That's not how it should be? If it is true, kind of think that maybe God is trying to say we put our lordship in the wrong place and He wants us to pay attention. It's tragic that our divorce rate may even be a little worse in the church than the world in general. God wants to get our attention. God is preparing the church through the book of Colossians to be ready for an unpredictable life. Every life, every marriage, every family will have huge unpredictability. Life will always have curveballs. It never works exactly the way that we think it should. we're going to deal a little bit more with the verses that are on the screen behind me in a minute. But we need to understand that God is deeply invested in marriage and in family life, partially to prepare us for what is unpredictable. Marriage in particular is two people who together are learning how to deal with life in such a way that they are growing continually stronger and are not defeated by the evil days that I brought up earlier that are in Ephesians chapter 5. We are not defeated, but we are learning to come together. We're not anchored in an idea of wedding cakes and big celebrations of weddings. We are anchored into Jesus. And throughout married life, we learn to be more like Jesus, to be more like him, more like how he has created us to live. God is at work. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Oh, this is a fun verse. I'm going to be honest with you. You take this verse out to the world in general these days, boy, do you get hammered. Mostly, as you probably can figure out, because of one word in there. And there's a whole bunch of different ways in which we can deal with this verse. Some of we can come up with excuses. The other way we can deal with this verse is to abuse it in a lot of ways. Some ways in which this kind of gets written off. If you go to the version in Ephesians, I mentioned that there's this parallel passage in Ephesians. And in Ephesians, it starts off saying, submit to one another. And so therefore, we might just say, well, it's about submitting to one another. There's a little bit of truth in that. Others might say, do you know what? This really fits the culture of the Roman Empire very well. And so we just, this is just about the culture of their day. There's a little bit of truth in that. But certainly not the whole story. Others will come along and say, well, do you know what? Christianity was remarkable in the first century AD, and that it elevated women and women's rights as never before in history, and that is absolutely true. Those are some of the excuses we might also almost make for Paul. There's another thing we can really do wrong with this verse, and that is just almost look at the first part. And that's where abuses have come up in history, of men treating their wives poorly because of this verse. And saying, you know what? I'm the boss. It's a horrible misrepresentation of what is here. We need to see this all together. Ephesians spells this out even a little bit more. And we're going to start by looking at the second half where he says, husbands, love your wives. And we'll stop there for a second. Because you know what's remarkable? The word that he uses here, husbands, love your wives. I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, that the New Testament almost had to invent a new word for love. It was a way to describe the way that God treats us. There were other words they could have picked, words that have to do with romance, words that have to do with how we treat each other. What's interesting here is the Apostle Paul picks this word for how God treats us. Husbands, love your wives. And then he goes on to say, as Christ loved the church. Particularly Ephesians. How did Christ love the church? Think about it for a second. How did Christ love the church? Got a cross over here. He was willing to die. Not just die, he was willing to give up all the glory of eternity He was willing to give up all the comforts, everything good, to come to this planet and suffer. He was willing to put aside absolutely everything. He was willing to do anything for the sake of the undeserving. Think about that for a second. That is the model we are given. This is difficult. Honestly, impossible request. Command, really, that Paul is making on husbands. And he's tied it into all that has gone before it in the chapter here. Looking properly at life. He spent the last several verses talking about love, forgiveness, peace. He's even been talking about singing out to God in worship. He's been talking about thankfulness, gratitude. He's been talking about all these things, about how we live out the Christian life. And then he starts talking about marriage. With this idea. You want to be a better Christian? You want to be a proper Christian? You want to grow in your life? Well, here's your chance, particularly when you start with men. Here is your chance to live it out. You're going to grow through living this out. What's going to happen is as you become a deeper Christian, you're going to be a better husband. And as you become a better husband, you're going to become a better Christian. As you become a better Christian, you're going to become a better husband. It's this incredible circle. It is God taking us deeper. The world might react against this verse, and maybe we do as well sometimes, because so often we have not seen this lived out. We've seen this passage done wrong. We have seen this passage abused in the church, particularly men, may have ignored their responsibility but demanded wives fulfill theirs. Men, the call on us is to love our wives as Christ has loved the church. This is hard. Instead, we might have used it as a way to avoid responsibility, to hide from the fact that marriage might first and foremost expose sin in my own life, because that's what Christ did. And Christians are to live in that model of marriage. We get caught up in that word submit. But I'm going to tell you right now that this is an idea that is a beautiful sentiment. There is something remarkable here. The call is for men to live such irresistible lives of love. The wife naturally wants to chase after him and follow his lead. This is so much more than just saying, okay, you're going to live this in your marriage. So much of it is, you're going to live this in your marriage, and you're going to be a deeper, better person because of it. You are going to work hard on this to do something incredible. The marriage becomes a means to spiritual depth, and therefore, instead of this verse becoming something that the world is offended by, becomes something that speaks deeply to a world that wants this model, that wants to see love lived really. This becomes something that points to the glory of God. This becomes something that changes our very world. But boy, it's hard. Home is the hardest place to live the Christian life. Because people know us the best. They see when we fail. They see when we struggle. Sometimes we think that, hey, we're persecuted people or something like that, that's when Christianity is really hard on them. No. Christianity is hard is when people can see our lives, examine us deeply. Where at times we might even feel that this is where I'm judged the most. That's where it's really difficult. This is where it's really the rubber hits the road. And if that is true, how we live the Christian life in our home, take in front of our spouses. We're going to talk about kids next week. That does fit Mother's Day. But particularly in front of our spouses, if we're going to live the Christian life, this is the most important because it's where they see us the most. This is where we grow the most. This is where it's most important to live out the gospel. We learn not to live for ourselves, but to live for someone else. And because we do that, we deepen our dependence on Jesus. Just a little bit of reading this week as I was getting ready. There's one book that said for a husband, like Jesus, we're called on to use our authority for ourselves ever. Jesus never came to earth and said, I'm special. You better be nice to me. You better do everything good for me. No, instead, he comes and he uses authority for others always. In the same way, a husband is always to serve his wife's best interest. And a wife is not called on, as author said, to be compliant, but rather to use her efforts and her will to empower her husband. We work together to find ways to grow. And in this way, the glory of God is driven deeper into each other's lives and is modeled for this world. Conclusion. This is one of those sermons I like to call. This is kind of a little name I've got in my head. A no eye contact sermon. In other words, not that people won't look at me, but you don't want to look at each other. Because most people are sitting beside their spouse. I'm sitting up on stage with my wife looking at me, so don't feel sorry for me. Why would I say it's no eye contact? You know what? We're all imperfect at marriage. Now, not everybody here is married. That doesn't mean this sermon is not for you. For some are younger, and one day you will be. God leads that way. Some of you are probably not going to get remarried, but you know what? You probably know somebody who is. Bottom line, we're all imperfect in marriage, right? And when we talk about marriage, we start to feel a little bit like, hey, I fail at this. Or we might look at our spouse and say, man, I wish you were better at this. One way or the other, there's a little bit of feeling like, hey, we don't have it all together. Sometimes we come to a marriage sermon. The easiest thing to do is say, man, I hope my spouse is listening. Yeah. sign we need to listen. Sorry. That was next thing in my notes. And why do we laugh? Because we all get it, right? Because none of us does it right. And none of our spouses do it right. That's kind of where we're at. My call today is that we take responsibility for our part in marriage. We take responsibility for how we grow spiritually. We look at this as a chance to know Jesus deeper. And knowing that my marriage may not be all that it is called to be, but I have a chance to grow. And how I'm going to grow is I'm going to know more about Jesus. And how I'm going to let my marriage grow, and then my marriage is going to grow. I'm going to be more like Jesus. And that's really the goal of marriage. That it's two people who help each other know more about what it is to be godly people. That we go through life becoming more holy, becoming more like God. And that is a remarkable gift. And marriage is a gift from Jesus because of it. It's a hard concept. It's a hard sermon. Therefore, maybe it's appropriate to finish with kind of a hard song. I invite our worship team forward. We're going to sing a song about committing ourselves to Jesus. A call to commitment on our lives, because really that's what it's about. We are called to commit ourselves. So let's take some time to worship our good God.
Please rise with us.
Father, today, let's understand something remarkable, a truth about how we live our lives. Touch our souls in a deep, impactful way, that we may be people who live this Christian life in such a way that when others look, they are just awestruck at the work of Jesus. That's really what this is about. Teach us to be people the world just sees, and they're drawn to something that is so different and so remarkable and so powerful. Thank you. Send us from here with your grace, your blessing, your strength. You are good. We love you. We pray this in your holy name. Amen. As always, you're invited just to stay behind and pray. There is some coffee in the foyer, but know that this is a place to do business with God, and that our God is remarkable and good. I will leave us with a benediction out of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. We'll read this. Now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely, and may your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. He who calls you is faithful. He will surely